My name is Zach White, and I'm a student here at Drake State, pursuing a degree in heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration. I am here to present to you our speaker, a world-renowned musician, Dr. J. Reginald Jackson. Dr. J. Reginald Jackson is a multi-accomplished instrumentalist, educator, and music theorist with an emphasis on creating instructional material for playing R&B, gospel, and contemporary styles by ear. His saxophone and keyboard performances, filled with improvisational ingenuity that weaves the warm and sultry tones of smooth jazz and R&B with the gritty, soulful sounds of gospel fused with classical overtones. Dr. J. Reginald Jackson's earliest musical influences developed as a result of his family, private lessons, and participating in school bands and choirs. This exposure cultivated a desire for artistic excellence, global reach. As a result, he has been afforded the opportunity to teach and perform throughout France, Japan, Turkey, and other areas around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. J. Reginald Jackson.
My name is Dr. Reginald Jackson. I'm Associate Professor of Music at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. I'm also the Gospel Choir Director, minister of music at several churches, and perform professionally on organ, piano, sax, and flute, and clarinet is my major instrument. And today I'm going to be demonstrating some of the elements found in this wonderful music we call gospel music, but you're going to hear influences of also jazz and the blues, which are also African-American music right here, folk songs. And so I'm going to begin with a song, which is really a spiritual, and we will talk about that in just a little bit. But the name of this song is called I Am a Poor Wayfaring Stranger. Okay, so as you could hear, some of the runs, riffs, licks, all of those are found not only in gospel music, but they're also found in jazz and in blues. And so I'm also going to be demonstrating on the piano after I talk to you a few minutes about the history of gospel music. First of all, it's impossible to talk about gospel music without mentioning the Africans who came to America in 1619 and who unfortunately were brought in as slaves and were treated horribly. It was a very terrible, horrible story about the origins of slavery and what our African Americans had to endure to survive. They were not taught to read, write, obviously not to vote, not to be involved in very much at all. Basically, they were slaves. They were torn away from their families. They were sold on the auction blocks. They were really treated horribly. And it's a sad, sad part of our history that we're looking at this month during Black History Month. So the thing that I like to think about and revel in is that they were very bright. They were brave. They survived. They found a way to thrive even in the midst of horrible conditions. And one way they did that is through the arts. whether that was singing or dancing or um, being creative with that. They were oppressed. Fortunately, they were allowed to go to church, and so one of the places they would go is to church. They had to sit in the balconies, and but they would listen and they would learn. And as they learned the hymns, they developed their own interpretation of the hymns. So that's why we have things like some of the things you maybe haven't heard of about lining hymns. Um, and there's wonderful music that emerged out of there were called the spirituals, which is one of the songs that I just played. But another thing that was awesome that they brought were these incredible rhythms. And this wonderful thing that we still use today is called call and response. So if you're familiar with gospel music, you know that a leader will say something, the audience will say it back, and they go back and forth. And that improvisation is still alive in all types of music right now, but it was born kind of one of those things that Africans brought with them from Africa, and we still use today. So there are a couple of things I would like for you to remember. And one of those is around the 1900s, right around 1905, 1906. From the spirituals, there was a wonderful group. Started a little bit before then, but the Jubilee Singers is one of the wonderful groups from Fisk University that started singing the spirituals and traveled around the world, performing those, and this music kind of picked up. And it really made an impact on the development of what we now know as gospel music. And then also the emergence of as I mentioned before, the spirituals, but also the blues, and then jazz, and then ultimately gospel. Well, the early workings of that were started right around 1906, 1907. But one of the things I definitely want you to remember is that in the 1930s, a man by the name of Thomas Dorsey, who is considered to be the father of gospel music, really coined this phrase and really shaped it into the early workings of what we know today. He was a musician who struggled, and this is one of the things that happened early on with a lot of musicians. Some of them wanted to strictly do spirituals and gospels. Others were doing blues and jazz, and of course, sometimes they merged together. But in the early part of the century, there were a lot of people who were struggling with that and wanted you to either pick a side. Either you're going to do gospel or you're going to do jazz. And so, but he really was instrumental in organizing some of the large conferences. He would go around the country, sing songs, teach songs, and then those songs would become part of the repertoire. So I'd like for people to remember him and his contribution. There are so many other wonderful artists. Sally Mae Martin, who's considered to be the mother of gospel music, but same kind of situation where she was writing songs and going around and teaching and doing some wonderful things. Some of the people who came along some 30, 40 years later, like the Reverend James Cleveland, would be important to know. Aretha Franklin, who passed away recently, was very instrumental in the early part of traditional gospel music with James Cleveland, helping to shape that. You may have heard of Andre Crouch or the Walter Hawkins and the Hawkins family, or, and there's so many, the Caravans with Shirley Caesar, who is still doing her thing today. There are many, many gospel artists. A lot of people know the current people better, because you hear Kirk Franklin today, and you hear Ty Tribbett, and you hear Fred Hammond, and you hear, the Winans. But before that, that struggle, particularly during the civil rights movement in the 60s, there was just so much of this music that helped to bring African Americans through those hard times. One of the other things I like you to remember about Thomas Dorsey is that he wrote a song called Precious Lord. And that is probably one of the most popular gospel songs in gospel literature. And ironically, Mahalia Jackson, who is somebody else you'd want to know, sang Precious Lord at his funeral. So that song is one that I would like for you to remember. Um, there's so much about this music that is interesting and fascinating. And hopefully, if you ever have a chance to do a research paper, even for a history class or for an English class, you will consider looking at gospel music closer, looking at the origin, looking at the instruments that is used. Um, One of the things we're talking about in one of the classes that I teach at UAB is the influence of commercializing gospel music, which is one of the things that they were really struggling against because they wanted it to be about the religious part of it more so than the secular or commercial part of it. And so going back to even the Fish Jubilee Singers, one of the things they did was take this music that was wonderful that the slaves did, and because that university was struggling, they started commercializing it to make money for the university. And so that started that, and that kind of continues where people are still now using all forms of music because people need to live and eat and survive. So I wanted you to know that. And I'd love to even go into detail about all of them at some later date. I'd love to come visit you in person and talk and demonstrate. One of the other things I wanted to do for you is to play something on the piano. I want to fuse together the elements again of jazz, gospel, and blues. Primarily, we're talking about gospel, but I think you're going to hear things that sound bluesy and that sound jazzy. So I always like to do that. One of the things in my research, much of it is on actually identifying and then labeling and then teaching students to play the chord patterns that are found in gospel, jazz, and blues. I have wonderful students from the Huntsville area who are doing a phenomenal job with that. And so since that time, I've created books on how to do that. You may know Kevin Wooten, Eric Hutton, Keon Johnson, Buford Crutcher. There's so many in the Huntsville, Decatur area that are taught early on. And what I did was, again, identify those chord patterns and teach them. So this song is called Summertime. It's actually from Porgy and Bess by George Gershwin. And I get a chance to demonstrate some of the things I'm talking about. So here we go. This is Summertime.